and we are joined now by Orly Noy, editor at Local Call, chair of B'Tselem, I hope I got that right, the Israeli Information Center for Human Rights in the Occupied Territories, and her latest piece in 972 magazine, which is a favorite of ours here, is called "Do Israeli Protesters Really Want Democracy?" Orly, thanks so much for coming on today.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
Of course. So, where are you headquartered right now? Are you in Jerusalem?
I am.
Yes. So you're in the midst of these over a dozen week of protests in Israel. They've been temporarily successful for the aims that they've set out, right? Netanyahu has delayed his judicial overhaul after a ton of pressure. But I'm just fascinated because at issue, according to the protesters, is democracy, right?
Yeah.
But that democracy doesn't exist in Israel, right? So that's the problem I have with the framing. And I, from your piece, I feel like we have I can garner that you share that opinion.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, for so many years, Israelis were left to believe, both by their governments and also, it should be said, by the international community, that you can be considered as a democracy and maintain a brutal occupation, that you can be considered as a democracy and actually practice an apartheid regime. And so Israelis really didn't have any reason not to understand democracy in such a damaged way, that, as far as it's functioning fine in protecting the basic rights of the Jewish citizens, then it's a perfect democratic country, and it's received as such by the international community. But no, you're absolutely right. Israel has not been a democracy for decades, and some would even argue never was a real functioning democracy.
I mean, it can't be. It cannot. Let's just speak plainly, like a settler colonial government that excludes how many occupied or how many Palestinians, people living in the occupied territory, are unable to participate in the Israeli democracy.
Well, let's look at the entire territory, actually, between the river and the sea, the entire territory under the Israeli regime, including the Palestinian citizens of Israel, which are also being discriminated against under the same apartheid logic. And in that entire territory, the Jewish population is actually the minority.
Mm.
So we do have, we were surpassed already demographically by the Palestinians in the entire territory under Israeli regime. So you have a full-fledged apartheid regime, which is being implemented in different ways. I mean, the face of the Israeli apartheid is different in Gaza, and it's different in the West Bank, and it's different in East Jerusalem, and it's different in inside the 48 lines, inside the Green Line. But one thing they all have in common, and that is to maintain in every means possible the supremacy of Jews over their Palestinian neighbors. In all of that territory, in Gaza, there is no presence of Jewish settlers, but it's still sieged by the same apartheid rationale.
Well, the premise too, as well, of the protests in terms of making sure that the court system is not politicized to the degree that Netanyahu wants, is also a frustrating conceit from my perspective as well, because as we see in the West Bank, the escalation of the displacement of Palestinians from their ancestral homes, the seizure of that by settlers who, the right-wing government of Israel is backing, there has been very little to no recourse by the court system for decades for Palestinians, because they say, oh, well, you need a deed. well, I don't have a deed. I've had this in my family for years. Well, too bad. Then it's this Israeli settler's home now. I mean, that is the system that this democracy is presiding over.
I mean, it's absolutely true. I mean, there is something incredibly worrying and alarming about the current attempt to completely empty the judicial system from any real substance. But at the same time, it should be mentioned that throughout the years, especially since 1967, but even before, towards the Israeli citizens, the Palestinian citizens of Israel, the Supreme Court gave little protection, very little protection to protect their rights, and actually legitimized every uh, every step that was taken by the Israeli establishment against Palestinians, the dispossession, the ethnic cleansing,
Hmm.
the demolition of houses, the very, very frequent administrative detentions that can be renewed endlessly, and the courts legitimized all that. The state-nation law, the citizenship law that actually prevents Palestinian citizens of Israel to marry spouses from the occupied territories and live together as a family unit. And the list goes on and on.
Yes. And that is the danger for me from the outside looking in of calling these pro democracy protests. Because, as you say, that makes the actions before this attempt to take over the court system, like that puts them under the umbrella of democracy when in fact it is the exact opposite. And that's my fear, really, of some of the reaction to the protests internationally. I mean, Biden is condemning it, and he's going in a bit of a back and forth with Netanyahu. But the reality is that the United States is not going to cut its aid based on this. And even if it does, the incentive that creates is not to stop the apartheid, it's to maintain the existing court system, which already upholds the apartheid.
Exactly. That's exactly right. It is very, very unfortunate that the international community, headed by the United States, for such a long time gave Israel the green line to just, deepen, continue, not just maintaining, but deepening the occupation and the apartheid regime by calling it or presenting it as a symmetrical conflict that should be. It's not a conflict, and it's certainly not symmetrical. It's a brutal violation of the Palestinians' most basic rights. And, we are right now in Israel at a very significant moment, I think, that uh, makes it possible, or requires, I think, to hold a conversation about the most basic fabrics of our socio-political life. Societies don't often get that chance, but right now we've been given a chance to really have an open conversation, a discourse about what it is, that democracy that we are calling out in the streets right now. What does it mean? Is it just a procedural democracy, just the envelope, the the construction, or do we want to say something about the substance that fills that envelope? What is the substance of the democracy that we are demanding now? And this conversation, sadly enough, is not being is not happening, or at least they're not happening enough in the Israeli society yet.
Yes. I mean, and I've been making this point for the past few weeks talking about this. You Fascism for thee and not for me is unsustainable. So now it turns on Israeli moderates, secular Jews within Israel, and but cutting out the ills that that population faces insufficient. I mean, we saw this even with, and you write about this in your piece, the Balfour protests 3 years ago. Netanyahu getting ousted then. Well, now he's back in power. I mean, so that kind of shallow um, way of addressing the deep, deep undemocratic roots in this country right now is wildly insufficient.
Exactly, not just from a moral stand, but also from a strategic stand. Because what Balfour proved is that it's not enough to know what you do not want. You need to know what it is that you want and fight for that as well. Because what brought people together in the Balfour protest was knowing that they do not want Netanyahu. So fine, they got rid of Netanyahu, and we got the so-called government of change, where a very strange coalition that brought together Meretz from the Zionist left and hawkish right-wingers such as Bennett and Lieberman. And what we should remember is that that government actually dissolved itself in order to protect the apartheid laws in the West Bank. So when we are looking at what's happening in the Israeli political sphere today, and if you listen to the Israeli discourse, you almost get a sense that some unidentified object from heaven just hit the wonderful Israeli democracy and shifted it from its course. That's not what happened. It was an inevitable outcome of a system that is built on notions of injustice and supremacy. And if we will not deal with those shortcomings today, we are bound to repeat and to go back to exactly where we are standing today.
Lastly, I mean, what's your sense of the composition of the protesters in the streets? I mean, record-breaking, millions, right? But then I see online, like anyone's carrying a Palestinian flag, it gets snatched from them. So yeah. I have no sense here in the United States what if there is some, like, what percentage of pro-Palestinian sentiment there is in the protest, but from the outside, it seems to return to like the tenor of our conversation today, which is just, it's wildly insufficient, that amount of representation in what we're talking about right now.
Absolutely. And even before we speak about the pro-Palestinians, we should ask, where are the Palestinians?
Yes.
Like, you don't see them. You don't see the Palestinian citizens, despite the fact that they are going to be the first and the most exposed communities to get hit and hurt by the reforms or the judicial coup that this government is promoting. So we really should ask ourselves, why is it that the Palestinian citizens do not come to these massive demonstrations? And the answer is very clear. It's because except for the anti-occupation bloc that you can find in the demonstrations, but they are quite small and quite restricted, the mass demonstrations are very militaristic in their terminology, are extremely nationalist in their practices. You all saw the masses, the seas of Israeli flags and the Declaration of Independence, and you can see it in the figures heading this protest, and the speakers. I don't think that there is a single ex-general left that has not spoken in those demonstrations yet. So maybe tactically, on the tactical level, it worked, and Netanyahu is not canceling anything, of course, he's just buying time. But in the on the strategic level, that type of protest just broadened the gap already existing between the Jewish and the Palestinian citizens, and without uh, narrowing or closing that gap, a true struggle for a real democracy can never happen in Israel.
Orly Noy, editor at Local Call, chair of B'Tselem, is the Israeli Information Center for Human Rights in the Occupied Territories, and you can read her latest piece in 972 magazine, which we will put in the link below in the description of the podcast and the show here. Thank you so much, Orly. I really appreciate it. I am getting frustrated by seeing some of these like wide declarations of how important these protests are, when for me it's like we're talking about everything but what the actual issue is. And yeah, so that's my frustration.
And I completely share your frustration, and if I can just add one sentence,
Sure.
To to your audience, be active wherever you are. Put pressure on your representatives in the Senate, in the Congress. This is not helping the Israeli society, giving Israel the green light to go on with apartheid and occupation is not only immoral, it's not helping us, the Israeli society, either. And there's a saying, friends don't let friends drive drunk. I think we have drunk people behind the wheel, so if you're a real friend, you will take the wheel from them.
Right. Well, yeah, I mean, thank you so much for your work within Israel as well, because I imagine, I can't imagine what the pressure is like there to kind of cease with your efforts. So great appreciation. Thank you, Orly Noy. Have a good one.
Thank you very much.